Thank you, everyone. Let's start today's session. Thank you for joining us at the SICS Seminars Human Potential Series, Human Health and Potential in the Face of Climate Change. I'm Vidya. I'm the Industry Development Manager, and I manage industry partnerships and academic collaborations at ASTAR's Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences, or SICS for short. As part of our vision to become a center of excellence in the human health and potential domain within Singapore, our institute has launched the SICS Seminars Human Potential Series. This is a monthly webinar that aims to foster exchange among professionals in the human potential research domain, build a network of like-minded individuals within the scientific community, and explore potential collaborations to further research in the human potential domain. Our esteemed speaker for today is Associate Professor Jason Lee. Associate Professor Lee is the Director of the Heat Resilience and Performance Center, Deputy Director of the Human Potential Translational Research Program, and Associate Professor at the Department of Physiology at Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine, and Associate Professor at N1 Institute for Health, National University of Singapore. He's also an adjunct investigator with ASTAR's SICS. Associate Professor Lee is a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine since 2012. He chairs the Sports Advisory Committee at MCCY and the Scientific Committee on Thermal Factors at the International Commission on Occupational Health. Professor Lee is on the Management Committee at the Global Heat Health Information Network, a joint initiative of the WMO and WHO to respond to technical advisory needs of the global meteorological and public health communities. Presented by Professor Lee, this webinar will address climate change as a challenge to human health, well-being, and work productivity. Professor Lee will present his research findings and strategies to combat heat stress, understanding the physiological aspects of heat exchange between our bodies and the surroundings. Interested to know how metabolic heat production and even clothing types to combat heat stress? Please hold on for a few more minutes. So without further delay, I welcome Professor Lee to share his exciting research with us. Over to you, Professor Lee.
Thanks, Vidya. Okay, I think you can see my screen. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are keeping well, yeah, as we transit back to norms. I hope you don't have many talks like this, that you can be in the physical mode, interacting with your colleagues. So thanks again for having me. I think as you see from the slide, my title is Human Health and Potential in Face of Climate Change, but I'll focus specifically on heat stress because that is my main focal area in my research on human health, on work productivity, and a little bit on safety because we don't have robust evidence on that component yet, but I think it's critical. I'll spend about 30 minutes or so to run through this deck of slides. I really want to leave the last parts for interaction. I will briefly do a quick intro where I'm operating from. Then I will talk about or provide an overview of how heat stress impacts at the societal level and an emphasis on occupational heat stress because we have some direct data as I speak. Definitely, I will not end with doom and gloom. I will provide solutions I hope we can undertake to deal with heat stress. Again, heat stress is just another form of stress. If you use stress correctly, it can be a eustress. It's not always distressed. Also, I hope I can impart that at the end of my talk. Then I will finally end my talk with a call for collaboration. I think that is my strategic intent after enticing you and hopefully convincing some of you the importance of this area. I think you can add an element on heat in whatever work that you are undertaking. Okay, here I go. Actually, I was trained as a sports and exercise nutritionist. So based on job demands over the years, I have evolved into a thermal physiologist. So be adaptable, everyone. Don't stick with what you learn in school. You need to adapt accordingly. So after 6 years in Loughborough, UK, and 12 years at DSO, I transited and joined NUS Med in 2018, and currently helping the ED for SICS, who is also the director for Human Potential Translation Research Program at NUS Med. So there we aspire to maximize human potential for health, for work productivity. Our focus is predominantly on the young, continuing that effort to adulthood, because we have a sister program called Healthy Longevity. Predominantly the same mandates, with a different focus in terms of the segments of the society. Then, of course, coming back to the talk, I highlighted in a changing environment because that will be what I'm focusing on for the remaining of my talk. Heat stress can affect the tenets, the key foundations of human health and potential. I think I hope you know by now, heat curtail your exercise quality or quantity. It can compromise your sleep, but not many. For those in the field of nutrition, I always cite this as an example. In Singapore, I remember when I was much younger in the public pools, right? The food stores beside the pool always do quite well, because when we are cold after a swim, it somehow improves your appetite. But likewise, if you go for a run, right, somehow you don't feel like eating immediately after. I think that is also an effect on heat. Try swimming in a hot pool versus a cool or cold pool. You might have different impacts on appetite regulation. But I'll leave it there. And I'm just saying that if you think sleep, exercise, and eating are the key foundations for human health, then I'm saying that heat affects each of these key factors. If you still remember, a couple of months back during the first half of June, right, the daily maximum temperatures were around 34 degrees Celsius. I remember I was in Japan, but received numerous reports that it's cooking back home. In recent months, unprecedented heat waves have affected many parts of the world. In June, shortly after I returned home, I remember Tokyo baked through 9 consecutive days above 35 degrees Celsius. Now, it's the most severe heat waves since official tallies begins in the 1870s. So that's one fact to remember. Then subsequently in the UK, mid-July last month, shattered records when it saw above 40 degrees Celsius for the first time since measurements commenced. Meanwhile, we see numerous heat-induced wildfires that ruin several parts of Europe. I think you see that all in the news. And most recently, last week, 400 cities in China were facing multiple widespread of heat waves. So the fact is, climate scientists have long warned that heat waves will strike more frequently. Summer will arrive much earlier. So that was predicted longer, but the prediction was a bit wrong because that future has arrived much faster than we thought and we hoped. So it's no longer climate anticipation, climate change anticipation. It is happening already. So we'll be seeing more and more of such headlines. On one hand, I think it's good, but on the other hand, I think human has this sort of response. Yeah, you say something, even it's bad too many times, we get numbed to bad news and you don't pay attention to it anymore. So be careful. I just hope that we don't get numb over time, because this will be a common news headline prospectively. All right, and I often hear too much safety will only compromise your potential in many of my conversations, because I work in the sector of occupational heat stress. So I want you to close your eyes and imagine this with me. Imagine you are a trapezist walking on a fine rope in a circus, and my challenge to you is to display your true potential. Okay, so now you are this trapezist. I say walk on this fine rope. Give me your best performance. So now think as you close your eyes and don't fall asleep. Would you seek to push the limits of your performance with or without that safety net or hand? In other words, say if without that safety hand below you, would you play it safe by simply walk across this rope? Or with this safety hand or nets, you probably will bother to push the boundary, do a couple of somersaults, maybe one twist, because you know that it's a safety net below you, therefore maximizing your own potential. So my main point here is, in short, just safety and performance are not at the different ends of that spectrum. You need to know the safety limits to achieve your true potential. I think often we do not know when is a human's potential. Either we overpush or we underpush. Overpush, you compromise health. Underpush, you compromise performance. So it's important as we move forward, it's all about personalization, not just personalized medicines, it's personalized potential, knowing when is your limit so that we can hit that sweet spot. Too hot? No problem. Heat stress and heat strain are not the same. Heat stress is the effects on the environment, on the person, plus the clothing that you don and the exercise intensity and duration. So while important, climatic heat stress is not the sole contributor to the resultant heat load induced on the person. We call the latter heat strain. So heat strain is what we are after. Heat strain describes how the person responds to heat stress. So you can say heat strain is the overall physiological response resulting from heat stress. So don't get too worried, because when it gets too hot, you can always manipulate the other two factors, your clothing, your exercise. You can slow down, you can take more breaks. If you use heat intelligently, you can say, okay, since this is training and not competition, it's all about inducing stress and therefore adaptations. I can actually train more efficiently on a warmer day. Instead of doing my 45 minutes, 30 minutes probably will hit my heart rate to the zone that I was targeting. You can even argue it is more efficient. Also, for certain groups, I think you can use heat as a friend and not foe. While the world gets warmer, right? My heart is for workers, the soldiers, the firefighters, the law enforcers, healthcare workers, etc., who don't have the luxury, like most of us, when it's hot, you just say, let's forget about the picnic this weekend. Let's go to the cinema or watch Netflix. But there are many sectors who don't have that luxury. Also, occupational heat stress can induce heat illness, accidents, degrade work productivity. So these are usually the three bubbles we're after. I think we know the heat injury, sustained productivity, but accident prevention are not quite well understood. Also, to fully understand the impacts of heat on individuals, both behavioral and physiological responses are important. Behavioral thermoregulation should first be considered using strategies like work rest cycle, allowing self-pacing during work if that's possible. Then if it's insufficient, right, then you need to couple with other physiological interventions, which I will teach you at the end of my presentation to beat the heat. So in extreme case, we have heat stroke. And the main mechanisms involves predominantly a transition from a compensable state where heat loss exceeds heat gains, subsequently to a non or uncompensable state where heat gain is greater than heat loss. So when this happens, your cardiac output is insufficient to cope with high thermal demands. So on this note, right, when you read the news, heat waves killed the elderly, they won't cook to death, just in case you say that they are so immobile. As often they die because they have existing cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular illnesses. Their cardiovascular reserve is limited, and when heat stress comes about, the first physiological response is to push some of the heat onto the skin, therefore compromising blood pressure. Also, we have to be careful as a society, including Singapore, ages. They're bound to be elderly who are living in isolation. And if that 2 weeks in June that we experience happen again and more frequently, risk will increase accordingly. Also, we do not want to wait for a bad case, then we start to take action. Learn the lesson. 4 years back, you remember that very bad fatality, that very unfortunate case in the armed forces, where we lost a life. That give us impetus to even do more. Also, we should learn and not repeat the same mistake. So when the body temperature continue to rise, leading to a direct toxic effects and an inflammatory response, right? This will create a vicious cycle. And eventually, when one died of, usually he dies because of multiple organ failure. Okay, something that is not well understood yet is, while we appreciate the acute impacts on heat stress, reports like this coming from Central America for now is very disturbing. It's not all about acute heat stroke. Here you see a chronic kidney disease of a non-traditional origin. They call it CKD-NT. It's a common finding among sugarcane workers in Central America. Recurrent heat stress and dehydration are the leading hypothesis. Evidence indicates a role of inflammation. So in the past, they attributed this to the genes and to the pesticides in the agriculture, but recent study compared between the supervisors clearly eliminates the role of genes, pesticide, because they were the same people at the same location. But this prevalence of chronic kidney disease of a non-traditional source only occur in the workers, but not on the supervisors. Also, low to moderate dosage of heat strain long-term can potentially incur such illnesses. So watch out. It's one of those things you bother to find, you might discover things that you don't want to see. So be careful. Right in the middle of the pandemic, I remember we had to formulate advisory to address the conflicting guidelines for protection against COVID-19, which is to be isolated. For us, for heat waves, we say, get out there, go to the cooling facility. So there are some conflicting, contradictory guidelines. So bear in mind, moving ahead, where you have this double whammy of not just single disaster. And right now, I heard from Europe having droughts, but then there are limited water supply, and what should they do? So there are these multiple disasters that will be occurring more frequently. So the ability to address such issues in our context and several other places, in this case, right, with aging populations, will become even more relevant, because some guidelines specific for one kind of disaster might contradict to another, but the public is facing both. So what should we do? This slide is fairly common sense. We know humans cannot last long in a hot environment, as compared to here we define as neutral, 20 degrees Celsius, and cold, 3 degrees Celsius. I think with such huge temperature gradient, you can't last long in a hot environment. Here, the same participant only managed to exercise for about 25 minutes, as compared to the cold environment, 3 times more. But what is not as appreciated is this, the impact on heat stress on human health and performance is not that straightforward. So here we arrange the maximum dry bulb temperature in ascending order in the local marathon. So you see from 27.9 all the way to 32 degrees Celsius. And you can see on the y-axis, it depicts the number, in terms of percentage of those who complete the marathon. We call them the number of finishers. 1% is about 500 runners. Ignoring the first bar, you can see there is a corresponding decrease in the number of finishers with a very minute increase in temperature. Now, this shows that humans are actually more sensitive to heat stress. We don't need that 5, 10 degrees Celsius. Humans sense that temperature affects the skin temperature, affects your thermal sensation and comfort. And then you decide whether you want to slow down. And in this case, forget about the race altogether. And therefore, you didn't finish the race. How I wish the extreme left bar is the longest bar. And therefore, I could tell a very nice story. That is complexity. It doesn't mean the cooler, the better. Sometimes there is this sweet spot when it's cool, but not cool enough. Humans still push very hard, but the environment is not as favorable. You see a decrease in the number of population too. Also, there's some complexity. It's not all about higher the temperature, the more dangerous. In fact, you can argue if it gets super hot in our context, it could be super safe because everyone will be hiding indoors. And therefore, the price we pay might not be for health short term, but we pay for work productivity because nobody's going out. But long term, it's never a good idea to hide indoors, because over time, the lack of exposure outdoor, maybe it be the sunlight or just exercise, has its own set of problem. So I just want to show this slide I mentioned briefly. While heat injuries such as exertional heat stroke and related productivity losses are well understood, few are aware of the impact on heat on decision making, and therefore this poor decision making leading to workplace accidents is going quite rampant right now. We can only speculate. Is the environment, is it also playing a role? Will climate change prospectively only increase poorer decision making at workplaces and therefore more accidents? So this needs to be looked at. And then compounded by the aging society. So guys, we have to be aware, we're not just talking about one climate change. There are in tandem other big problems in the society. So how about climate change and the aging society, where we know the elderly and those with chronic disease are poor in thermal regulation, i.e. they are lousy in losing the heat they produce, predominantly a compromise in skin blood flow and sweat production, which are the two main avenues of heat loss. So we need to keep an eye on this group as we expect more individuals to remain, more older individuals to remain in the workforce, especially those who are assigned to exertional work. So keep a lookout. Again, Prime Minister recently in his rally speech, mentioned about this perennial problem. I think that is where SICS is putting huge efforts to tackle this unsolved, insufficient replacement. And the bad news is very clear epidemiological findings show these associations between high temperatures and adverse pregnancy outcomes, including preterm birth, stillbirth, low birth weight. So looks like there's few problems ahead, and also protection of our people against extreme heat here it's not just about work productivity, prevention of heat injury. It has a whole list of other societal benefits beyond workplace health and performance. And how about the children in school? This analysis shows that heat can also inhibit learning. Are all our schools air conditioned? Do we want them to be all air conditioned? So this is a good analysis and more follow-up studies to show. But here it shows that heat can affect your learning. So already I'm thinking, do we need to wear those pinafores or attire that seems to be thermally uncomfortable? Do the professors who are supposed to approach things with evidence-based need to wear their suit and ties at conferences, blasting the aircon? So we need to relook whether can we dress more appropriately in the smartness, but do it with common sense. Why should we wear the tie where we want to drop the energy utility? Sometimes we are self-inducing all these problems, right? So beyond work, recent evidence also suggests that exposure to high temperatures and humidity levels during exercise can reduce intensity, duration, or even the desire. That is the recent evidence, not so much on the intensity or duration. Those are quite well proved. Exercising in extreme conditions we know can lead to heat illness that can be fatal, right? So given both the importance of exercise and the dangers of overdoing it, the sports medicine authorities have developed a range of guidelines to advise physical activity, especially outdoor. I think such guidelines, should be extended beyond just the sports scenes, the occupational scene. I think soon even to the public health scene, where potentially we could advise the public when certain threshold is being crossed. So here, Sam, I believe Sam is in this call too, one of our RF. So here he used the data over the last 3 decades. He led a calculation of the physical activity loss at both global and country level. Also, you can see that the burden falls disproportionately on the tropical countries. We have to pay attention to this part of the world. I think there's a general perspective, of people living in the tropics because it was always warm and humid. It is a bit warm and humid. It will get a little bit more warm and humid. We sort of give up to the environment and say, just live with it. It can't change much, just survive. I think that is where we are bleeding unknowingly. Also, over the 30-year period of this analysis, the residents of tropical countries experienced an increase of 2.6 hours lost per day in the 90s to now 5 hours lost. So that's about another twice as much. So what it means here, if in Singapore, assuming after 8 and before 7, you won't exercise because the sun is out and you have to work anyway, you're left with that few hours before work and after work. If you want to lie in, you probably miss the first few hours. You have overtime after work, you lose that hours. Naturally, you think between 8 and 7, you don't exercise because the weather is unfavorable. It actually means that your opportunity to exercise outdoor is now severely curtailed with climate change. Unlike in temperate countries, right? You can have a walk in the park at 12 noon, no problem. So these are precious hours that as we progress, you will find that we don't have many of these favorable hours. Also, be careful. Don't bleed unknowingly to death, because this is important knowledge that you have to appreciate and do something about it. Okay, those are all the bad news. Let's talk about the good news. So we have solutions at hand. We know heat is a showstopper. So in this graph, you see if you don't do anything, you will stop exercising at some point because your thermal strain will get so high and you're just going to stop. But there are ways to beat the heat. And as a physiologist, I will recommend you the physiological approach. Not only is evidence-based, it is also very sustainable. I'm not asking you to get more air cons. A good physiological solution should reduce your heat strain at the start and attenuates the rate of rise during exercise and increase your thermal limits. Because if you have a good physiological solutions that can do either of these 3 phases, right, your thermal strain or your thermal capacity on the y-axis is now expanded. With this expansion, it has a direct positive implications on your x-axis, which is your ability to work in a hot environment. So if somebody comes to you and provide a solution, but cannot explain physiologically whether it causes a reduction, attenuation, or extension, then likely it is a gimmick. So now I impart an evidence-based approach in curating the proposed solutions that you might encounter prospectively. So here is the order of how you should harness a proven array of techniques or solution to beat the heat. Get yourself aerobically fit. If you're entering into a warm environment, give yourself a couple of weeks to heat acclimatize before the event, cool yourself. If you can, have both rest cycle and drink appropriately. Every of this contributes to the graph I showed earlier, and that should heat-proof you in face of a warming world. I can see, unfortunately, we have not developed that magical pill that can do all three things. That is a reduction, attenuation, and extension. That magical pill is called aerobic fitness conditioning. So I hope as you go about keeping yourself aerobically fit for health, by doing that one thing, you are also heat-proofing yourself for the future. I hope that gives you a reason, to go for another kilometer, to increase that 1 kilometers per hour speed. Now, get yourself aerobically fit, because it will do you a lot more good as you prepare for a warming world. So what we should seek to harness the mentioned techniques, right, to maximize your thermal capacity. Bear in mind when accident happen, yeah, this is one possibility that the person still choose to go past limits. And usually these are motivated ones. So pay attention to the workers. I just got a stats from South Korea. They were telling me the deliverables, those who send parcel from place to place, they are under tremendous stress to deliver those goods. And about 10 to 30 die every year due to overworking. And in summer, the heat stress is an added stress. So that's something we want to study more, whether now our Grab deliverables or equivalents are overworking because they are paid by piece. And therefore, these are the group that might ignore these environmental stressors, the cue to slow down. It's different, right? When you are being paid by per hour, then naturally you can afford to slow down and the economic implications are no longer on you, but on your employer. So both ways you lose productivity, but in this case, depending whether it's by piece or per hour, you will be paid by the employee or the employer accordingly. So bear in mind, exertional heat stroke is not just about incurring a high temperature. There's also good evidence to suggest the immunity of oneself plays an important role. But I will not elaborate further, but I just want to say if you're unwell, under recover at the onset, right, it predisposes you at a higher risk of incurring heat stroke. So be aware of that too. Okay, so just to paint what is to come, I think the health and well-being of individuals exposed to heat are linked to their thermal comforts, encompassing also their intrinsic factors that should be integrated in assessing the ensuring impacts. So thermal comfort can be degraded due to passive heat stress, while when an individual may experience a change in skin temperature. I always imagine now I'm in the CBD area, I come out of the aircon building. On my left is McDonald's. On my right are healthier options. But if I can make the walkway to the healthier options, for example, more conducive and promote me walking there, I don't mind walking a little bit further to reach the healthier options, even though McDonald's is just closer to where I am, but it's unsheltered because I need to bear the sun, the radiation. So sometimes if you think of it creatively, you can use thermal comforts to affect decision making. Why I use this example, the McDonald's is nearer because I made the assumption when that piece of land is being put it out for bidding, right? This McDonald's will get the plot of land that is closest to the office worker because they want to attract them. It's okay, we make them pay for it. But then from a governmental perspective, we can intelligently design in a way that is more comfortable to walk further for healthier options by providing a cooling walkways, for example. Again, just one of those, what ideas that I just came up with. It is therefore important, I think, in this slide to move towards a human-centric approach. I think a heat health advisory, a number and expect everyone to perform the same action, I don't think that is the way to go, especially in our tropical context. Because based on our geographical location, we shouldn't expect that 10, 15 degrees jump in temperature. So it's a very tight range, but yet can still affect our behavior as I shown earlier. But in order for any heat health advisory to work locally, I think we need to fuse that with our physiology, and may it be using your wearables or using your phones that can measure some physiological metrics. I think subsequent advisory will be more specific. Okay, Finally, such reports on record high temperatures are no longer novel. The signs of global warming are very clear. In fact, it's already happening. I hope the ongoing pandemic has given us a full dress rehearsal to work together across agencies, across sectors to provide good solutions. So this climate change will no doubt affect our work productivity and health. Problems associated with working people in harsh conditions, such as in the heat, needs to be accurately quantified first before providing the solutions. As I say, often overlooked, we need to also study the harder to quantify impacts, the social impacts of heat and off workplaces. The reporter asked me, the increased shooting always occur in summer, overseas, a lot of accidents occur during summer. Is that a component of heat stress? We don't know, but that is a good place to start, whether we can prove that is the case. So we owe it to the workers, who toil out there and in some places in there, but under warm conditions. So let's do our parts in safeguarding them. Okay, finally, my last few slides is a call for collaboration. Just let you know what we are doing in this area, hopefully to inspire thoughts for prospective partnerships. So here we commenced Project HeatSafe in late 2020. The goals of HeatSafe is to map the complex threats of heat exposures to human health and work productivity in these exertional populations before identifying sustainable and hopefully preventive policies and actions to reduce these ill effects. So that's one. Upcoming, we're going to do work in the health districts. In this case, focusing on increasing physical activity, physical literacy in children. And also in Cooling Singapore Work Package B, we'll be examining the risks arising from behavioral and physiological responses of healthy but yet vulnerable populations. The children, the unheat acclimatized adults could be the tourists, and of course, our elderly, due to the aging society. Here we seek to derive physiological thresholds and hopefully to formulate recommendations for population-specific advisory and not one size that fits all. So we are here eliciting evidence, hopefully to move towards a more accurate heat health advisory. And finally, I just want to point you to a good resource here. Is the Global Heat Health Information Network. GENE, in short, is an independent and voluntary forum of scientists, practitioners, policy makers focusing on heat health. It is supported by WHO, WMO, and UN. So great resources in this website. So I do encourage you to check it out. And finally, I hope by now you are convinced that the rise in ambient temperatures will definitely compromise health and performance. So here, I just want to advertise the new Heat Resilience and Performance Center. They will be established in the coming months in the NUS. Now here we look and seek for partnership to look at fundamental and forward-looking approaches, not just cool, innovative solutions, any solutions that can give us significant delta. We welcome that kind of ideas to address heat resilience over the longer term. Okay, with that, so now this is my last slide. I want to acknowledge my team members. Again, they did and are still doing all the work. The team is heading back from South Korea after finished that effort in Hanoi. So they're constantly collecting data in and out of Singapore in hope to first quantify the problems before prescribing the solution. So acknowledging them at the same time, thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jason Lee, for that very informative session. Now we'll move on to the QA. You may type in your questions using the Q&A function in the chat box, or you have the option of staying anonymous if you wish. And I will read out the questions out to Prof Lee. Alternatively, you can type +1 and I will call on you to ask the questions live. So whichever way you feel comfortable. And I will do my best to ask Prof Lee as many questions as we can, but due to time constraints, I apologize ahead if I'm unable to get to your questions. Yeah, you can start typing in your questions. Okay, I'll start first. So thank you, Prof. Lee. So could you just expand and give us more information on the type of clothing? You mentioned a bit about it, and especially for like the climatic conditions in Singapore, like do you have like any partnership with like big companies or like fabrics, or what kind of recommendations would you make based on your experience?
Yeah, no, great point. In fact, that is what we are looking at from a material perspective. I'm not a clothing scientist. I can only advise dress light, dress in light colors. That's all we can advise. No, don't overdress. I see people still commuting in the suit and ties, and then coming to the room, blast out the aircon. I think we are self-inducing all these thermal discomforts. But yeah, looking and calling out, thanks for raising that up. I'm calling for people who are experts in material. If you ask me, what are the specifications, right? If there are any material scientists here, I'm imagining a kind of material that can propel the immediate water vapor around me, almost like unseen, but is there 5 cm, 10 cm around me, and it's constantly dry. Maybe you can, using smart design, nanotechnology, weave that into our clothing, still allowing my sweat to be secreted and be laid on my skin, but then create an artificial dry environment around me, almost like my clothing, there's this material that's keep on pushing immediate water vapor around me. Why is that important? Because as long my sweat can do its job, sweating does not lose heat, right? The sweat must be evaporated. So if you can create a microclimate that allows my sweat to be evaporated, I think that will be a game changer. Because a gram of sweat that is evaporated loses a lot of heat. Those who have been in the Middle East, right, you can be very hot but very dry. You can actually be very comfortable. In Singapore, actually, our dry bulb is not super hot. 30, 32, extreme case 34 degrees Celsius. It is the humidity that you agree that is causing largely the thermal discomfort.
Yeah. There are a few questions for you. I'll read it out. With this anonymous person asking, with rising temperature, will it lead to increased metabolism by human, thus increasing food consumption per capita over time?
Yeah, again, good answer. I don't know, because broadly, I actually feel if my hypothesis is when you're hot, you tend to eat lesser. When you're cold, you eat more. And therefore, if anything, I'm more worried when it's, as you get warmer, human might eat lesser. Which could be good in some context, right? If you want to lose weight, then you can actually use, if that relationship is true, heat suppress appetite. If that mechanism is established, whether through the ghrelin or leptin pathway, then you can use that intelligently to regulate food consumption. Again, my current hypothesis, I think, is the cool environment promotes intake. So now if our public pool, right, there is one lane for those who want to lose weight, maybe it's worth increasing the temperature by a couple of degrees Celsius so that when they finish the swim, they don't feel so cold or cool, and therefore might promote appetite. Because for those who want to lose weight, the practitioners say, no, you go for a swim for your joints because it's not good to run, right? Then I've seen reports after months, they come back and say, I actually did swim every morning, but I don't see a lot of weight being lost. And then we found out they actually eat a lot after the swim. So can temperature be used as a regulator to our appetite? So that's all I can speculate for now.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Simon, says like, what role can food and beverage play in reduction, attenuation, extension of heat stress? Any particular food or beverage that are super effective based on your experience?
Yeah, work is ongoing, but one thing we have studied, with other groups is the use of ice slurry and cold drinks. More physics than physiology, introducing that cold depths. In the past, right, we were unsure because there's argument if you are hot, you put something cold into you, aren't you telling your physiological signal to suppress heat loss mechanism? Not because they respond to the introduction. Now I'm very hot, I give a cold stimulus, it might actually reduce skin blood flow, reduce sweating, and therefore I might trap heat. But what research has shown, while that is true, right, there is physiological negative impacts. But then there's also physics. Essentially, you introduce something cold. And long story short, we found that in this case, at least at rest, physics beats physiology. The net outcome of that cold depth is still greater than the compromise in sweat loss or skin blood flow. If you don't believe me, at rest, drink something cold. After a while, you will become cold. Very hard for me to believe after a while you drink something cold, you become hot. And like it or not, I see social media that is this thing that's going around saying that when it's hot, drink something hot. Yeah. Be careful. We know sometimes when things get repeated 1,000 times, it becomes a fact, like 8 glasses of water a day, eat an apple and chase the doctor away. There's no single study to prove that, but sometimes we hear it and we accept it as a fact. I don't think there is strong evidence to suggest when you are hot, drink something hot. That will only make you hotter.
Okay. There's another question for you. It says like, hi, Jason. So what is better, cooling with water, but hence increased humidity, or hot but dry? Example, there are fans that spray water to have greater cooling effect.
Yeah, it depends what is the context here. If you are having exertional heat stroke after exercise, then the water as a medium, because of the convective element, is the most powerful to cool ones down. So from a treatment, from a therapeutic perspective, aggressive cooling with cool water is the best. But now you're not talking that context, not a young man with exertional heat stress. Now you're talking about elderly. You definitely don't want to dump an elderly in the cold tub of water. And that is where I think you have read the literature with fans, with some water. Why water is because if the elderly cannot sweat as well, you want to introduce artificial sweat, in this case in the form of spraying some water. There's also other technique. I say ask the elderly to put on a wet t-shirt and put a fan. But I just don't think, at least locally, the elderly likes to wear a wet t-shirt and sit in front of a fan. There are other reasons why they don't do that. But I think spraying some water, if they are dry on the skin with the fan, I think it's good to know from a preventive perspective to release some of the heat stress. Or even soaking the hands or the feet in cool water. Using them as a conduction point to contact the coolness, and the natural Venus return will distribute the coolness that's contacted at your palms and your feet, and you will circulate around the body. That's quite a common technique used for this group of individuals.
Okay, that's interesting. So another thing I was wondering was like, since you're like interested in the fabric and other things, how about like housing or like buildings in general, like to make it like much adaptable or like much cooling than like blasting air cons, or like save on some energy. So what are your thoughts on this? Like have anyone like been working on this area?
Yeah, there are. Again, I'm not an expert in that, but for what I heard, the evidence-based approaches includes painting buildings, white paint, some special paint that can reflect the sun. I think they have the trial right now as I speak in Bongo, painting some of the buildings. But in terms of our home, right, there are very practical ways. I mean, some of these are learned, from our European countries where aircon is not common. So at the start of the day, they will pull down the blinds, make sure that throughout the day you don't accumulate the heat, and also shield it from the onset, and therefore the rooms will not be filled with the heat because of the radiations. And ventilation and airflow remains key, in my opinion. And you agree with me, when you are warm, right? Once you have the element of wind/convection, you usually feel much more comfortable. You know, as long the place is still and humid, it gets very uncomfortable. When it's warm and humid, but there's the wind element, I think it helps a lot. So instead of turning the aircon, I strongly advise that you consider fans, because not only it is cheap, it is sustainable, it is good. In extreme case, you can use your water, drink it or shower it with it to cool you down. But more importantly, I think internally, we consider that strategies I just showcased, aerobic conditioning, heat acclimatization, these are techniques that can increase your thermal capacity. And it's also good for health. Today, people use heat also as a therapy, because there are some individuals, they can't exercise, but just by soaking yourself in warm water, over time, it has shown to have good health benefits. So I know each time we talk about heat, it's always like a bad thing, but I want to give some good press to heat. If you know how to use heat correctly, right, it can be a friend and not a foe. Also, don't give all the bad reps to heat. I say heat can be used as a training tool. Heat can be used as a therapy.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Ren Tan. So the person says, thanks, Jason, for the great presentation. As we live in a heated world, chronic heat exposure is bad for us, but avoiding the heat will render us more vulnerable to later exposure. How do we overcome this vicious cycle?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Yang Ren. No, I think I know this guy. I want to put this question specifically on a message to the parents with children. I know we all love our children, and I highly recommend that we don't remove them from the sun because it's too hot. Because what Xiaoren said is, it will definitely induce a vicious cycle. Acutely, you want to protect them, right? Concerning of heat stroke. But over time, not only the fitness will be degraded already in today's context, right? The children's fitness, I think we can speculate, it's not as strong as what we used to be. These days, there's a lot of entertainment at home, e-gaming, video gaming. So I think we should expose them to the sun. Other goodness, myopia, I think there are a lot of benefits why we should put it in the sun. Again, this is what I said in my earlier slides. Because we do not know what is the limit, we try to avoid completely, and that causes a bigger problem. We should know how to deal with the heat, stick to prescribed limits. Children can actually exercise under the sun, but not too long. How much is that too long? Heat-proof them so that they will be more protected against climate change. If not, it's of a higher risk, because there will be situations they have to go out into the sun. If we don't prepare them beforehand, we are actually imposing more risk downstream. Also, use the heat, expose them progressively. If not, you will incur the vicious cycle Xiangren mentioned in his comment here. Also, this is a message for the parents. The heat can be a friend if you use it correctly. Anything too much is usually not good. I always say this, right? Don't see something, you cannot have a bit of exposure. I always say, go with moderation. Or the only thing that can be excessive is love. Other than that, everything is almost in moderation. Don't drink too much, don't drink too little. Don't expose yourself too much, don't expose yourself too little. Oh, we have two more questions, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think we might have to take one final question before we end the session, or if you can quickly cover in a minute or so the last two questions, that would be great.
I will answer directly, since I can see. Yes, obesity, but just bear in mind that you don't have any thermoregulatory deficit when you're obese. Your sweat ducts works perfectly. You can move the blood from internal to the skin perfectly. The only thing that is a risk obesity, just imagine that it's an added layer. That layer just trap heats a little bit more, and therefore every heat you produce, you have that additional layer to overcome. Of course, from a efficiency perspective, you will be less efficient because now you are carrying a lot of dead weight when you move a given when you move a given step. So that is the only compromise. But all in all, yes, if everything else stays constant, the obesity definitely is another risk factor, because usually that also coupled with low aerobic fitness. Then finally, a quick response to that. Cold acclimatization and heat acclimatization are almost mutually exclusive. So you don't compromise one because you are very heat acclimatized in the other. In fact, to let you know, there is no physiological basis for cold acclimatization. Or where there are physiological explanation to heat acclimatization, sweating, increase in skin blood flow. Cold acclimatization is largely a behavioral adaptation, that you are more sensitive to cold and therefore you put on the jacket earlier than one who is less cold acclimatized. So for me, if I go to Canada, it takes me longer to put on the jacket because I'm not so sensitive. Whereas my Canadian counterparts will put on the jacket more, put on the gloves more. So they are more behavioral acclimatized, not so much on physiological adaptation. There's no robust data to suggest that you sweat less when you are cold acclimatized or you constrict more. There's no such evidence as compared to heat acclimatization.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Jason Lee, for this wonderful session and very interesting sharing session. And like, there are a lot of questions to answered it very well and patiently. And for the other participants, we hope that you found this webinar interesting and insightful. And we've recorded the session to share with you, and we will share the link to the recording very soon. And it's available for a very limited period. And we will be having another session of the SICS seminar, Human Potential series, next month. So do keep a lookout for our direct mails and posters and our LinkedIn pages for further updates. So take care, stay safe, and thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.